Ladies and gentlemen, we are reconvening for session 3 of our conference. Again, thank you for being punctual. The session that we're about to hear deals with the core of military operations in Burma, Army and Air Force, and they're presented by the core of this conference, two gentlemen who are a mainstay of AEHHB, as I've now learned to say. The first will be Andrew Kilsby, who rejoices in the description, which is actually very, very rare in Australia, of independent professional historian, military historian. There are next to none that I know of, although we could talk about other candidates. But anyway, Andrew is a very distinguished alumnus of UNSW Canberra, and he's going to speak to us today about on-active service. And I'll introduce Darryl in the appropriate time, which will be in about 15 and a half minutes' time. Andrew.
I need that extra 30 seconds.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you to MHHB for putting on this conference. So far it's been quite good, even though I know everything that's been talked about, which is why I can't help myself down the back. I've got so much to talk about. Yes, I can. I'll go outside. The Australians have had Australian military connections with India go back right before the mutiny of 1857, and there were many channels for Australians to get into the British Army and straight into the Indian Army. The Indian Army wasn't formed formally until 1897. I knew I'd get that wrong. 1895, and the army in India was called the British Indian Army, and the reason for that is the British units coming to India, joining the Indian Army, came under the purview of the General Headquarters in Delhi. They were no longer controlled by London in that direct sense of command. Some of the Australians that people would know who had connections with India, of course, was General Blamey, General Vasey, General Finlay, it goes on and on and on, who attended the Staff College in India. There were exchange officers, there were training officers, there were also people who went through Sandhurst in the UK. For example, the two sons of Harry Chauvel from the Desert Column were both in the Indian Army. The son of Brigadier General Dean of the Light Horse was in the Indian Army. The son of General Talbot Hobbs was in the Indian Army. The daughter of the two daughters of General Bruce, who was the Inspector General of the Forces in the 30s, both married British Indian Army officers. One of the girls died in India. And the son of Major General William Holmes, who was killed in France, was also in the Indian Army. And finally, I come to Captain Mervyn Hobbs, MC, who got married in 1921 when he'd just gone into the Indian Army, or just going into the Indian Army, the son of General Hobbs. He married, went to India on his first posting. His wife fell pregnant. They came back to Perth for her to have the baby. He brought his service pistol with him, as you did in those days, and went out and did some target practice with his dad down the local valley. His wife was there watching. This is about a week or so after the birth. And they came back next morning. She shot herself with his service pistol. According to the newspapers, she didn't want to go back to India. But I think it was more like to do with postpartum depression. And then we also produced quite a number of generals coming out of the Indian Army. In fact, some of them were quite extensive. Major General Ross Mackay, who became Chief of Staff of the Pakistan Army until 1951. Major General Walter Cawthorne, who was the DMI for the Indian Army in 1945, founded the Pakistan Army Inter-Services Intelligence Department, and was later Deputy Chief of Staff until 1951. He also came back here and founded ACES. We had General Arthur Selby, who was at Quetta Staff College in 1925, an instructor from 26 to 30, and then with the British/Indian Army, because he had Indian troops under his command in Eritrea, Persia and Iraq. So it just goes on. Oh, and don't forget Harley Wadsworth, who was the commander of the Indian Armored Corps at the end of the war. So there's quite a long history there. So in this particular chapter of this book, I've talked about the ways that Australian military people could actually get into the Indian Army. And a lot of the nominal role I have now of Australians who served in the Indian Army in some capacity is going now to 6-7 pages long, and I've only touched the surface. There's hundreds of Australians that served over that period of time. Putting aside the fact that we were selling them horses for the Indian Army since 1834, right through to 1939, when the Indian Army began to mechanise. After World War I, there was a flood of young Australian officers. Normally they distinguished themselves in some way on the Western Front of Gallipoli, and I mention a couple of them in this book. The one, my favourite, of course, I shouldn't say of course because you don't know that, of course, but Walter Gamble, who was at Gallipoli and then in France, won an MC in France, changed over to the Indian Army in 1917. 1917, 18 and 19, a lot of first AIF officers were transferred. And then he served in the northwest frontier, 2 campaigns against the Waziris, and then in Burma, at Barmo, with the Burma military police in 1930-31. Retired in 35 from the 8th Punjab Regiment, came back to Australia, got married, had 3 sons. War broke out, rejoined his regiment in India and served on into the Second World War. He was mentioned by Burchett in 1942, who came across him when he first arrived in Fort Hertz, right up in the northwest corner of, have I got that right? Northeast corner of Burma, where he worked with the Kachins, the so-called Northern Kachin levies, and basically set them up as a guerrilla army against the Japanese. At one point, I won't say an army, but certainly there were guerrillas. At one point, his group, the only group actually fighting the Japanese in Burma, because the British Army had all gone, and the Americans as well, and the Chinese. So he then went, he got an OBE for his work in Burma with the Kachins. He then went over to the Tripura state, one of the princely states, where he took over their first Tripura Scouts battalion and took them to the Arakan campaign, the second Arakan campaign, to work as guides, guerrillas, intelligence gatherers, and so on. He was there until September 45, just before the last offensive in the Arakan started. He got mentioned in dispatches for that time. Now, he retired, of course, at the end of the war, 1947. He came back to Australia, died in 55 of tuberculosis, you name it, he had it, from all the way back to Gallipoli with dysentery. When he got to the end of his time in the Arakan, he was then suffering his 27th attack of malaria. So here's a man who died prematurely, did great service, and died prematurely because of the rigours of his continuous service, basically, from 1915 right through to 1945, with a short interregnum in Australia. Pleased to say that tomorrow at the book launch at the Shrine, his only surviving son is coming home. The Morrison family, and that's David Morrison down on the right-hand side there. Oh, sorry, I should say, this is Gamble here. He had an Australian intelligence officer who was an ex-tin miner from Malaya. And that's his Burmese and Indian cohorts there in his group. There are 2 American OSS operators on the left, whom I haven't been able to identify yet. Now, David Morrison didn't join the army until into the 1920s through Sandhurst, and went off to the northwest frontier in the Indian Army. In World War II, he fought in North Africa, Eritrea, Syria, and Italy, and then back to Burma, where he took command of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Punjab Regiment, which is probably the most prestigious battalion command in the infantry of the Indian Army. And in the Arakan, fighting against some very determined Japanese resistance in an area where the small chungs or creeks, every creek bank had been fortified by the Japanese, so they had a terrible time trying to get through that, and the tactics weren't the best. Anyway, long story short, he got shot and died in hospital the next day. His son, who lives in England, I've been in correspondence with him, told me that he was taken off the battlefield on a stretcher, smoking a cigarette and saying, "I'm okay." He didn't make it. The third person I wanted to talk about was one that's mentioned in the sporting section, actually. I don't want to steal your thunder, Ian, but Lieutenant Colonel Dr. MD Roland Raymond, who was an international rugby union player from New South Wales. He was the Rhodes Scholar from New South Wales in 1924. The story that I came across that brought him to my attention was, and Ian will talk more about his particular career in rugby and so on, but there was an Australian Hurricane pilot in Rangoon in early 1942 who was shot down by the Japanese, badly shot up in the leg, landed okay. They got him out into hospital. He woke up the next day in his memoirs saying he found his leg in plaster and he'd been treated by an Australian doctor. And I thought, why don't I know who this is? So I did some, down that rabbit hole I went and discovered it was this chap, Raymond. Now, Roland Raymond then took part in the retreat out of Burma with his first aid group, got out with his wallet, I think his wallet was shorts, so that is what he said, and ended up serving with the Indian Army in Italy and got an MBE for his troubles. Another story was Frank Hunter, one of 20, he was in the 2nd 18th Battalion, went to Malaya, Singapore with the 8th Division. He was one of 20 Australians that joined the Indian Army through an emergency commission in Singapore in the late days of 1941. And fortunately for him, he got away to, well, he was posted to India, off he went to Ceylon and then into India. A few of the others that were on those courses got captured by the Japanese. So he also, in this case, he was the 9th Battalion of the 8th Punjab Regiment. He was a captain in the Middle East. He went to Quetta in 1943. Excuse me, became a brigade major in 36th Infantry Brigade, the 14th Army. And then in October 44, he went to the headquarters of the Allied Land Commander in Land Force Commander in Southeast Asia in Ceylon. He was given an MBE for gallant and distinguished services in Burma and committed suicide on the 4th of 8th, 45. The service record is not clear as to why this happened, but it was, I noted that he'd taken 60 days leave in Australia before that, and maybe there was something going on in his family life. Another sad story. Then I come to Keith Walker. Keith Walker, those of you who are experts on Kokoda, which I'm not, but you would know of the term Walker's Ridge. Well, Walker was the guy that took the ridge with his company, decorated, but his brother was killed in Boona. You've got a posthumous MC. And I just want to read something, if you can find it. Yes, okay. So, the ridge line which his company finally captured became known as Walker's Ridge. Walker had enlisted on 3rd November 39. Walker's younger brother, who'd served with 2nd 7th Battalion throughout, was killed in action in the Gurna-Boona area of New Guinea on the 5th of December 1942. The death of his brother and intense combat and wounding in the following months brought Walker to exhaustion. He was court-martialed when he created a disturbance in the lines of the battalion by firing a rifle and then taking an unauthorised flight in an RAAF aircraft, where he made an unlawful descent by parachute without the permission of the pilot. In March 45, he was again court-martialed in the field on 3 charges, including drunkenness. Now, I only relate that because, along with the suicide and the deaths, to give some small insight into the pressures and the stresses on these individuals at the time. Now, Walker, I almost started talking about the 2 minutes, yeah, that's perfect. almost started talking about the Navy there for a second. You hear yourself. Okay, what have I got? Oh yes, so apart from those folks, there was also a number of logistics officers working in India right through the war. People in headquarters positions, such as Cawthorne, for example. And there were also second AIF officers like Walker, 168 of them, which came to India in 1945 to supplement the British units, which were short of officers. Many of them had been killed in the Burma campaign. And they got in the last 2 or 3 months of the war. Some of them saw a little bit of service, active service against the Japanese, but most ended up in Sumatra or even Java. And a lot of them just, after the war, just went back again. So they were only there for a short period. One of them, Hunter, went on to stay on in the British Army after the war and served right through to 1963 with an MBE. So he was in, in the Rhine, what do you call that, the British Army on the Rhine. They're also in Hong Kong and other places. So as you get from that very quick overview, there are long connections between Australia and the Indian Army, British Indian Army, and many of those officers saw service. The ones are not in this book, of course, are the ones who served in Italy, and North Africa, and Greece, and other places with the Indian Army. And that'll be subject of another book, hopefully, in 2 weeks. That's it, I think.
I believe there's a tradition. I popped out at lunchtime, and it's quite warm out there, so I think the phrase is, gentlemen may remove their jackets. I said the ladies have already removed their hats. So